There are wounds that live so quietly inside us, we forget they're there, until someone knows exactly where to press. You were once a little girl who learned that love could disappear in an instant. That safety was something you had to earn, that your feelings were too much, too loud, or simply wrong. Today, we're going to walk together through the tender landscape of your heart, not to judge what happened, but to understand how those early lessons became the very map someone else learned to follow. My dear sister, you are not broken. You were simply taught to doubt the wisdom of your own soul. She's still there, you know. That little girl who learned to make herself smaller when the voices got louder. The one who discovered that being good meant being invisible, and being loved meant never, ever being too much trouble. She learned to read faces like weather patterns, scanning for storms before they arrived. She became fluent in the language of tiptoeing, of holding her breath, of swallowing words that might disturb the fragile peace around her. Maybe she was the child who ran to comfort others when they cried, even when her own heart was breaking. The little peacemaker who believed that if she could just be perfect enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, then maybe the love would stay. Or perhaps she was the one who learned that her emotions were inconvenient, that tears made others uncomfortable, that anger was unladylike, that speaking up meant being labeled as difficult, dramatic, or demanding. This little girl developed a superpower that felt like survival. She could sense exactly what others needed her to be. She became a master of adaptation, shape-shifting her personality to fit whatever space she was given. She learned to apologize for taking up room in the world. What she didn't know then, what breaks my heart to think about now, is that someone would later study this beautiful, adaptive heart of hers like a scholar studies ancient texts. They would learn every page of her story, every vulnerability, every tender place where she learned to bend. But here's what I want you to know, darling. That little girl's sensitivity was never a weakness. Her ability to love deeply, to care fiercely, to feel everything so intensely, these weren't flaws to be exploited. They were gifts, sacred gifts. The problem was never with her tender heart. The problem was with those who chose to use that tenderness as a weapon against her. That little girl, she deserves to be protected now. By you. With all the wisdom you've gained, all the strength you've discovered, all the love you've learned to give. She's been waiting so patiently for you to come back for her. You learned early that love was conditional. Not because someone sat you down and explained the rules, but because you felt it in your bones every time the temperature in the room shifted without warning. Love became something you had to earn each day, like coins collected in a jar that could be emptied at any moment. You discovered that affection could be withdrawn as punishment, that silence could be used as a weapon, and that your worth was always, somehow, up for negotiation. Maybe you remember the feeling of your stomach dropping when you heard footsteps approaching your room, never knowing if those steps carried warmth or storm clouds. Or the way you learned to gauge someone's mood by the sound of a door closing, the rhythm of their breathing, the particular way they said your name. You became an expert at reading between the lines, finding the hidden meanings in every gesture, every pause, every glance. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that your emotional survival depended on staying 3 steps ahead of other people's feelings. Love, for you, meant learning to dance around landmines. It meant making yourself responsible for everyone else's emotional weather. It meant believing that if someone was angry, sad, or disappointed, it must somehow be your fault, or at least your responsibility to fix it. This is where you learn to give pieces of yourself away like breadcrumbs, hoping to find your way back to safety. You learned that love meant sacrifice, that caring meant suffering, that being needed was the closest thing to being wanted. And oh, sweet soul, how perfectly this prepared you for someone who would later recognize this pattern like a familiar song. Someone who would see your beautiful, giving heart and think, here is someone who has already been trained to put my needs before her own. They didn't create these patterns in you. They simply found the grooves that were already there and learned to play the same old melody, knowing you would dance to it because it felt like home, even when home had always hurt a little. But here's what that little girl didn't know. Real love doesn't require you to walk on broken glass. Real love doesn't make you responsible for someone else's emotional world. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink so that others can expand. Real love feels like solid ground beneath your feet. Every child who grows up in emotional chaos develops a map of their own tender places. Those soft spots where they learned to expect pain, where they discovered they were vulnerable, where their little hearts got bruised over and over until they learned to protect those spaces with hypervigilance. Your map might include the fear of abandonment, that bone-deep terror of being left behind, forgotten, or replaced. Maybe it was carved into your heart the first time someone important walked away without explanation, or slowly etched by 1,000 small moments when you felt invisible in your own life. Perhaps your tender places center around the fear of being too much, too loud, too emotional, too needy, too complicated. This fear might have been born from being told to calm down, quiet down, or simply be different than you were. You learned to make yourself smaller, to edit your personality in real time, to become a more palatable version of yourself. Or maybe your deepest wound is around feeling not enough, not smart enough, not pretty enough, not accomplished enough to deserve love that stays. This ache might whisper that everyone else received some manual for being lovable that you never got, some secret knowledge about how to be worthy of consistent care. Some of your tender places might be about control, the desperate need to manage outcomes, to prevent disasters, to stay hyper-aware of every shifting dynamic around you. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that relaxing your guard meant danger was coming. These tender places became your emotional fingerprint, as unique as your DNA and just as permanent. They shaped how you approached relationships, how you interpreted other people's behavior, and most importantly, how you learned to protect yourself from further harm. What you couldn't have known as a child is that these very tender places, these areas where you learn to expect pain, would become exactly the territories someone would later claim as their own. They would study your map with the precision of a scholar, learning every pathway to your heart's most vulnerable spaces. They would discover that pushing against your abandonment fears made you hold on tighter. That threatening your sense of being too much made you scramble to become smaller. That questioning your worth made you work harder to prove your value. Your tender places became their roadmap to control. But oh, beloved, here's what I want you to understand. There was nothing wrong with having these tender places. Every sensitive soul develops them. They were proof of your capacity to love, to hope, to keep your heart open, even when it cost you. The problem was never with your tenderness. The problem was with those who chose to exploit it. They don't arrive in your life like the villains in movies, with dramatic music and obvious warning signs. No, they come disguised as the answer to your deepest prayers, speaking the exact language your wounded heart has been waiting a lifetime to hear. They are students of the human soul, and you, my dear, became their most fascinating subject. They watched how your eyes lit up when someone remembered the small details of your stories. They noticed how you melted when someone seemed to truly see your pain without trying to fix it immediately. They studied the way you apologized for things that weren't your fault, how quickly you blamed yourself when anything went wrong. They cataloged your tendency to give others the benefit of the doubt long past reasonable limits, your beautiful habit of finding excuses for behavior that should have had none. They learned that you were hungry, not just for love, but for a very specific kind of love, the kind that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. the kind that saw through all your carefully constructed walls and loved what it found there anyway. So they became exactly that love. They mirrored back to you a version of acceptance so intoxicating, so perfectly calibrated to your deepest needs that it felt like magic, like destiny, like finally being understood by another human being. They discovered your language of love. Maybe it was acts of service, and suddenly they were doing thoughtful things that no one had ever thought to do before. Maybe it was words of affirmation, and they had an endless supply of exactly the praise your soul had been starving for. They noticed what made you feel safe, then wrapped you in that safety like a warm blanket. They saw what made you laugh, then became the funniest person you'd ever met. They observed what made you feel special, then made you feel like the most extraordinary woman who had ever walked the earth. But here's what they were really doing, sweet soul. They were creating an emotional laboratory with you as their willing subject. They were learning which buttons to push, which levers to pull, which words could dissolve your boundaries like sugar in hot tea. They studied your patterns of attachment like a scientist studies behavior. They learned that if they withdrew their attention, you would chase. If they created drama, you would rush to restore peace. If they made you doubt your perceptions, you would look to them to tell you what was real. They discovered that your tender places weren't just wounds to be healed. They were access points to your entire emotional system. Touch the abandonment fear and watch you become more compliant. Trigger the not enough wound and see how hard you'll work to prove your value. You thought you had found someone who loved your sensitivity. What you had actually found was someone who saw your sensitivity as their pathway to power. They built you a beautiful theater where you could finally rest, or so it seemed. The stage was set perfectly, soft lighting that made you look radiant, music that soothed your nervous system, props that felt like the home you'd always dreamed of having. In this theater, you were the star of a love story that felt too good to be true. Because, darling, it was. This wasn't real safety. This was performed safety. Every gesture was calculated. Every word was scripted. Every moment of tenderness was designed to keep you believing in the story they were telling about who they were, who you were together, and what your future could hold. They created an environment where your hypervigilance could finally relax, where that part of you that had always scanned for danger could take a deep breath and think, finally, someone who sees me, someone who gets it, someone who will never hurt me the way others have. But even in this theater of false safety, part of you knew something wasn't quite right. There were moments when the mask slipped, when you caught a glimpse of something cold behind their eyes. Times when their stories didn't quite add up, when their behavior toward others showed you a different version of who they could be. Your intuition, that wise, ancient part of you that had kept you alive through so many storms, tried to whisper warnings. But you had been so hungry for this feeling of safety, so desperate to believe that your search for real love was finally over, that you learned to silence your own inner voice. You told yourself you were being paranoid, too sensitive, too damaged by your past to recognize real love when it finally showed up. You convinced yourself that your doubts were just old wounds talking, not your soul trying to protect you from new ones. In this theater, you learned to edit your own reality in real time. When something felt off, you found explanations that made it feel okay. When their behavior didn't match their words, you focused on their words. When your body tensed in their presence, you told your body it was wrong. You became the director of your own deception, rewriting scenes that felt uncomfortable, cutting out moments that didn't fit the love story you so desperately wanted to be true. The cruel irony is that in this theater of false safety, you became less safe than you had ever been, not from obvious danger, but from the gradual erosion of your own ability to trust yourself. You were learning to override your instincts, to doubt your perceptions, to hand over the authority of your own experience to someone else. They didn't have to break down your boundaries by force. You learned to lower them yourself, brick by brick, in service of maintaining the illusion of the love you thought you had found. There's a specific moment when it happens, when your clear, firm no gets translated into their persistent maybe. It's so subtle, so gradual, that you might not even notice it's occurring until you realize you've somehow agreed to things your soul never wanted to do. They have a genius for making your boundaries feel unreasonable. Your no becomes evidence of your damage, your trust issues, your inability to let love in. They frame your healthy limits as walls that are keeping you from true intimacy, barriers that prove you're not really committed to the relationship. Maybe you said no to something that made you uncomfortable, and they responded with hurt confusion. I thought you loved me. I thought we were closer than that. I thought you trusted me. Suddenly, your boundary wasn't about your comfort or safety. It was about whether you loved them enough. Or perhaps they approached your no like a negotiation, finding creative ways around it. They might not have forced you, but they certainly didn't respect you. Instead, they wore down your resistance through persistence, guilt, or emotional manipulation until saying yes felt easier than continuing to defend your right to say no. They became experts at finding the exact words that would make you doubt yourself. You're being overly sensitive. That's not what I meant. You're remembering it wrong. I would never hurt you intentionally. Each phrase carefully chosen to make you question your own experience, your own feelings, your own right to have boundaries in the first place. Your compassionate heart, that beautiful tendency to see the best in everyone, became their greatest asset. They learned to frame their boundary crossing as misunderstandings, as differences in communication styles, as evidence of how much they loved you and wanted to be close to you. You found yourself in endless conversations trying to explain why something felt wrong to you, as if your feelings were facts that needed to be proven in court. You learned to justify your own boundaries, to provide evidence for why you deserve to have your limits respected. And slowly, imperceptibly, you began to erode your own authority over your life. Your instincts became suspect. Your feelings became overreactions. Your boundaries became suggestions rather than requirements. You started saying yes when you meant no, not because you wanted to, but because the cost of maintaining your boundaries had become higher than the cost of surrendering them. This sweet soul is how they gained access to territories of your life that were never meant to be shared with someone who wouldn't cherish them. This is how your body became a place you no longer felt safe. How your home became a space you couldn't control. How your very sense of self became something that belonged more to them than to you. But here's what I want you to remember. Your no was never unreasonable. Your boundaries were never too much. Your instincts were never wrong. You were simply taught to distrust the very wisdom that was trying to save you. There comes a moment, and it arrives differently for each of us, when the fog begins to lift. Maybe it happens in an instant, like a lightning strike of clarity that illuminates everything you've been unable to see. Or perhaps it creeps in slowly, like dawn breaking after the longest night of your life. For some, the awakening comes through witnessing how they treat someone else, a child, a friend, a stranger, with the same calculated cruelty they've been using on you. Suddenly, you see the pattern from the outside, and you realize this isn't love having a difficult moment. This is a deliberate system of control. For others, it arrives in the exhaustion of your own soul. That bone-deep weariness that comes from constantly translating someone else's behavior into something acceptable, from endlessly making excuses for treatment that no loving person would ever need excused. You might recognize it in the moment you catch yourself apologizing for their behavior to others, or when you realize you've stopped sharing your real life with friends because you can't bear to see the concern in their eyes. The awakening often comes disguised as the simple, devastating question, when did I become someone I don't recognize? Maybe it happens when you notice the silence where your laughter used to live, when you realize you can't remember the last time you felt genuinely joyful, truly peaceful, or completely yourself in their presence. When you understand that you've been holding your breath for so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to breathe freely. The awakening can feel like grief and relief arriving at the same moment. Grief for the time lost, the energy spent, the parts of yourself that were slowly erased in service of keeping peace with someone who was never interested in peace, only in power. But oh, the relief. The relief of finally trusting your own eyes, your own experience, your own heart. The relief of stopping the exhausting work of translating their cruelty into love, their manipulation into care, their control into protection. In this moment of awakening, you begin to remember who you were before you learned to shrink. You start to recall the sound of your own voice before you learned to whisper. You catch glimpses of your own wisdom before you were taught to doubt every instinct that tried to guide you toward safety. This awakening doesn't feel like anger, not at first. It feels like coming home to yourself after a very long journey in a foreign country where you never quite learned to speak the language fluently. You begin to see with crystal clarity how your tender places were mapped and exploited, how your childhood wounds became their blueprint for control, how your capacity for love was turned into a weapon against your own well-being. And in this seeing sweet soul, you reclaim something precious, the authority over your own experience. No one else gets to tell you what you felt, what you lived, what you endured. You know, you remember, you survived. And now, for the first time in perhaps years, you can see clearly enough to choose what comes next. After the awakening comes the sacred work of rebuilding, not the life you had, but the life you deserve. And it begins, tender soul, with learning to tend the garden of your boundaries like the precious sanctuary they were always meant to be. Your boundaries are not walls meant to keep love out. They are garden gates meant to let in only what can truly nourish the tender growth of your recovering heart. They are the gentle but firm boundaries that say, this far and no further. This much and no more. This energy is welcome here. That energy is not. Learning to trust your instincts again feels like learning to walk after a long illness. Your inner voice, that wise, knowing part of you that was silenced for so long, speaks in whispers at first. You might doubt what you're hearing, question whether you can really trust these gentle urgings toward your own protection. But oh, how patient your soul is with you. How gently it offers you chance after chance to practice saying no without explanation, to choose your comfort over someone else's convenience, to honor your energy as the sacred resource it has always been. You begin to notice the difference between healthy relationships and the imitation of love you've become accustomed to. Healthy people don't need extensive explanations for your boundaries. They simply respect them. They don't make you feel guilty for having needs or selfish for protecting your peace. Real love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Real love doesn't ask you to prove your care by abandoning your own well-being. Real love wants you to be whole, healthy, and authentically yourself. As you tend this garden, you learn to recognize the early warning signs you once ignored, the subtle ways someone might test your boundaries to see if they're negotiable, the difference between someone who occasionally disappoints you and someone who systematically erodes your sense of self. You practice saying, "That doesn't work for me," without offering a detailed explanation of why. You learn that no is a complete sentence, and that your comfort matters as go files much as anyone else's. You discover that protecting your peace isn't selfish. It's the most loving thing you can do for everyone in your life. Some days, tending this garden feels natural and easy. Other days, it feels like swimming upstream against a lifetime of conditioning that taught you to prioritize everyone else's needs above your own. But slowly, beautifully, you watch something miraculous happen. The people who belong in your life appreciate your boundaries. They respect your growth. They celebrate your journey back to yourself. And those who don't, well, they reveal themselves for exactly who they always were. She doesn't announce herself with fanfare. She doesn't arrive with dramatic declarations or grand gestures of transformation. She simply wakes up one morning and realizes she has stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. This woman, the one you are becoming, remembers what it feels like to laugh without checking someone else's mood first. She remembers the sound of her own voice speaking her truth without measuring every word for its potential to disturb someone else's comfort. She looks in the mirror and sees not a collection of flaws that need fixing, but a face that has weathered storms and emerged more beautiful for having survived them. She sees eyes that have learned to trust their own vision, hands that have learned to protect what they hold precious, lips that have remembered how to say both yes and no with equal conviction. This woman understands that her sensitivity was never a weakness to be exploited, but a superpower to be honored. She knows that her capacity to love deeply, feel intensely, and care profoundly are gifts she gets to choose how to share and with whom. She has learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between being useful and being loved, between someone who takes from her energy and someone who adds to it. She no longer confuses intensity with intimacy or chaos with passion. When people show her who they are, she believes them the first time. She doesn't create elaborate stories to explain away behavior that feels wrong in her body. She doesn't twist herself into impossible shapes to make unhealthy relationships feel healthy. She has made peace with the parts of her story that feel painful, not because she's forgotten them, but because she's integrated them into a larger narrative of survival, growth, and wisdom earned through experience. This woman knows that her past doesn't define her, but it has certainly refined her. It taught her to recognize her own worth, not by how others treat her, but by how she treats herself. It showed her that the most important relationship she'll ever have is the one with her own soul. She's learned to fill her own cup first, not out of selfishness, but out of wisdom. She knows she can only pour from overflow, only give from abundance, only love others as fully as she loves herself. She chooses her company carefully now, surrounding herself with people who celebrate her growth rather than those who prefer her small. She creates spaces that feel like sanctuaries, relationships that feel like soft places to land, conversations that leave her more energized than when they began. This woman you are becoming, she's not perfect. She's not healed of every wound or free from every fear. But she's whole, she's integrated, she's home in her own skin. And she remembers, with crystal clarity, that she was never asking for too much when she asked to be loved with kindness, respected with consistency, and treated like the miracle she has always been. There is a quietness that comes at the end of a long journey, not the silence of emptiness, but the profound peace of finally arriving exactly where you were always meant to be. And where you were always meant to be, sweet soul, was here, at home in your own heart. You have traveled so far from the woman who once believed that love required her to disappear. You have walked through the valley of recognizing how your tender places were used against you, climbed the mountain of learning to trust your own voice again, and crossed the bridge back to yourself. This homecoming doesn't feel like the end of a story. It feels like the beginning of the truest chapter you've ever written, the one where you are both the author and the beloved protagonist. The one where your worth is never questioned because it was never actually questionable. You sit now in the sanctuary of your own self-respect, and it feels like the softest place you've ever known. Not because it's without challenges or free from all pain, but because it's authentic, it's yours, it's real, in a way that all those performed relationships never were. You understand now that coming home to yourself was never about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who you always were, underneath all the layers of conditioning that taught you to doubt your own beauty, your own wisdom, your own inherent right to be loved exactly as you are. The little girl who learned to make herself small, she's here with you now, but she's no longer afraid. She knows that the woman you've become will never let anyone use her tenderness as a weapon against her again. She feels safe in the fortress of your newfound self-knowledge. You know now that your sensitivity is not a flaw in your design. It's the very thing that makes you capable of creating beauty, offering healing, and recognizing authenticity in a world that often settles for imitation. Your capacity to feel deeply is your gift to a world that desperately needs people who still know how to care. Your boundaries are not walls that keep love out. They are sacred gates that only allow in what can truly nourish the garden of your soul. And oh, how that garden has begun to bloom again. How green and alive and full of possibility it has become. You sleep peacefully now, not because your life is perfect, but because you are no longer at war with yourself. You wake up looking forward to spending time in your own company. You move through your days like someone who knows her own value, not because someone else finally saw it, but because you remembered it was always there. This is what healing looks like, beloved. Not a destination you arrive at once and stay forever, but a practice you return to again and again. The practice of choosing yourself, of honoring your truth, of believing that you deserve the same kindness you so freely give to others. You are home now, home in your own skin, home in your own truth, home in the unshakable knowledge that you were never asking for too much when you asked to be truly loved. You were just asking the wrong people. But now you know, now you remember, now you choose differently. And the woman you have become, she is everything that little girl ever dreamed of being, strong enough to be gentle, wise enough to be kind, healed enough to love without losing herself. You are home, sweet soul, finally, beautifully, completely home. In the gentle silence that follows, know this: your journey of healing continues with every breath, every choice, every moment you remember that you are worthy of the love you so generously give. You are not alone. You are not broken. You are simply home.